What are the most valuable things everyone should know, right? That was the question.
Yep.
And so you wrote up this little response. How many answers?
42 rules.
42 rules.
Yep.
Really short, snippy responses of 42 rules everyone should live by. And this was the inspiration for this book,
That's
correct?
right, yes.
And so
it got very popular on Quora.
Yeah, it was your most viewed.
By far.
And one of the most viewed on Quora,
Yes.
the site.
Yes.
And I was going over that list, and I loved it so much. And they're all really bite-sized little, snippets. And so I was wondering, if you're up for it, if we could go over that list
Sure.
as a little exercise and maybe expand on some of these points.
I want to tell you a funny story about that list, too. So, it got popular, so that was cool. But then a friend of mine, Greg Hurwitz, who's an author in L.A., he's written a series of books. They're Orphan X books. And this third one just came out. It's called Hellbent. And in the first one, which was The Nowhere Man, he had the female love interest put those rules on her refrigerator so that her son could live by them. So it's so funny. It's the rules have gotten a life in a fictional universe, which I think is really comical.
Great.
Yeah, it's really great. And he's interleaved them through the 3 books. So that's been really fun to watch that happen.
So the first rule, tell the truth.
Yeah. And I changed that a little bit in the book because that's one of the ones I used in the book. That's Rule 8. I said, tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Right.
And the reason I changed it a bit was because, you don't know if you're telling the truth. Sometimes you just don't know, right? And what do you know anyways, right? Do you know the truth? Well, no. But you do know when you're lying, at least some of the time, and you'll do it anyways. And so the hypothesis that I'm developing in the book is that you should stop saying things that you know to be untrue. And I go into it very deeply. Like there's an idea. It's one of the deepest ideas of mankind, but it's certainly one of the deepest ideas of Judeo-Christian civilization, that the way that you turn potential into reality. So imagine, people think that they live in the material world. That's what we think because we're materialists, we're modern people. But we don't really think that. If you look at the way people behave, this is how they act. They act as if they live in a world of potential, whatever potential is, because potential is what might be. And it's not real, right? Because what might be isn't real. What is real. What might be is potential. We don't even think of something that isn't real as actual. But if I say to you, you're not living up to your potential, you go, oh yeah, well, I know that. And if I say, well, there's new potential in tomorrow, you think, yeah, well, there is. So what really you confront is a field of potential. And you can decide how to transform that into reality. Not like you're a genie, but still with a fair bit of freedom. The world that you speak into being with truth is good. And I believe that. I think that's the case. Like if you start a relationship and it's predicated on lies, it's like you can manipulate the other person into delivering what you hypothetically want, but all you're doing is setting the stage for a descent for one or both of you into something closely resembling hell. You get yourself in situations where there's no honorable way out, and then you pick the least dishonorable way. That's white lies,
Sure.
But a white lie, and there's black truths as well.
Sure.
I mean, sometimes you don't know how to tell the difference. And I would say, well, those are limit cases. You're not sophisticated enough to make a judgment there. But sometimes you bloody well know that what you're saying is wrong and you shouldn't say it. Most of the time. And you do it anyways.
Almost every time you do it.
That's right. Almost every time.
We have an innate sense of ethics.
Yeah. What the atheists, I'm generalizing obviously, but they end up twisting themselves in knots trying to explain consciousness away and trying to explain free will away. The other thing I should say about atheists is it's not like I think they're any less intellectually honest than fundamentalists. Right. In fact, often quite the contrary, because you see fundamentalists, the problem with the fundamentalists, broadly speaking, is that they insist that their truths, the biblical truths say, have the same status as scientific truth. Right. And that's just not right. Like whatever the stories in Genesis are, they're not scientific theories. You read something by Dostoevsky or Shakespeare, and you think, that's so powerful, it's so true. It's like, no, it's not. It's not. It's fiction. You think, well, okay, but wait a sec. It's profound and true, but it didn't happen. Well, how can it be true? We think, well, it's distillation, right? So you look at human life and you map it and you extract out the key elements to it and you tell this beautiful story that has the relevance across all sorts of domains, all sorts of people's lives. Well, that would be fiction, great fiction. Well, the biblical stories are like you take a bunch of lives and you distill them into stories, And then you take a bunch of stories and you distill them into myths. And a myth has that kind of unbelievably potent truth that's a consequence of the distillation of human wisdom. And there's something about it that's transcendent and true across time and all of that. It's eternal in some sense. And so that starts to border on what people would normally, would appropriately consider religious. Pick up your burden, so that would be the cross. That's the burden of mortality and betrayal, because that's what the cross signifies. Pick that up voluntarily and bear it. Okay, so that's your first goal. You do that without resentment and without bitterness. That helps constrain evil. Life is hard. You're subject to malevolence. You accept that without bitterness. And that requires, that's a heroic act, because really you're going to take that on fully. Right, so that helps you transcend that suffering. Say, well, and then if you accept the suffering that life entails and you accept the responsibility of confronting malevolence and overcoming it, there are parts of you that are going to die and transform. Right? You know what it's like to learn something. It's like you learn when you get walloped. It's like, oh, I got hit. It's like, oh, something in me has to die because it was really wrong, and that's why I made this mistake, and that's so goddamn painful, and you barely get through it. But then you reemerge from that underworld, and you're a better person for it. And so Christ is a symbol of that thing that dies and is reborn. Well, what's the worst possible story? Well, that's easy. The worst possible story is the most innocent possible person gets tortured the worst possible way because everyone betrays him, even though he didn't do anything wrong. Okay, well, so you can't push that story any farther, so you hit a limit. And so you have that limit case, and then you think, well, what do you do about that? You die and you're reborn because you can transcend that. But so there's limit cases in the Christian story all the time, because what Christ encounters is the tragic suffering associated with mortality. That's the crucifixion, right? That was a terrible form of torture. And the fact that it comes about because of betrayal and malevolence. It's like, well, that's your life. Like, that's life. It's suffering tainted with malevolence, and that's the world that you inhabit. Everyone. So how do you deal with that? You take it on voluntarily, you try to constrain malevolence, and you allow the parts of yourself that are unworthy to die and be reborn. The self would also be, from the Jungian perspective, everything you are plus everything you could be. And so the reason he called it the self was because it's the totality of you. And you don't understand that because, like, what the hell do you know about you? You are the most complicated thing that ever existed anywhere. And so you have some sense of yourself, but, like, what do you know? You don't know how you're conscious. You don't know how you see. You don't know how you think. You just don't know anything about yourself, except that here you are and you experience pain and all that. So God only knows what you are in the final analysis. But I also think, I've had this intuition, that sometimes that the material world organizes itself in a way to reach up to the spiritual world, and that the spiritual world arranges itself to reach down to the material world, and sometimes they touch. And maybe they touched in the case of Socrates, and maybe they touched in the case of the Buddha, and maybe they touched in the case of Christ, because you have these individuals that are somehow head and shoulders above the rest, and it isn't easy to account for that.
We were discussing your 42 rules. So the second one being, do not do things that you hate. Is it possible in this life, especially coming off of our last conversation, we're human beings carrying around heavy burdens, being crucified, right? Metaphorically. How do we avoid doing things we hate?
Well, I think we should define hate first carefully.
Okay.
It doesn't mean do not do things that are difficult. It doesn't mean stop procrastinating and attend to your duties. It means if what you're doing makes you feel weak and low and contemptible and mean, then you should stop doing them. It's a signal. It's like the voice of your conscience, except it's more embodied. It's like, oh, I just felt miserable when I did that. I was ashamed of myself. Maybe that's another way of stating that.
Don't
do things that make you feel ashamed. Now, it's tricky because you might say, well, what if you're more ashamed of things than you should be? Well, sometimes that happens, right? You have an overactive conscience. Well, then you have a dialogue with your conscience. You talk to other people to find out if you're being too hard on yourself. But you might think, well, if you wanted to exist on good terms with yourself, then doing a bunch of things that you regarded as shameful is not a very good pathway to achieving that.
Sure.
And so, and you can notice, and that these are what would you say? These are injunctions to pay attention. It's like, I'm not saying follow other people's rules, although often you should do that, but that's not the issue. The issue is watch and decide for yourself. Decide when you're saying something that you regard as untrue, and don't say it. And notice, it will make you feel weak if you say it. Like you might feel sneaky and manipulative and that you got away with it, and that sort of arrogance. And I wouldn't recommend that. That's a bad pathway. But often it makes you feel little and small and useless and ashamed. It's like, okay, if you don't want to be miserable and wretched in your life, then stop doing the things that make you feel that way. Pay attention to your shame. Okay, that's pretty low resolution. Don't cheat at games. Okay, that's a lot more articulated, but it's a reflection of the same thing, because you'd say, well, if you're playing a game with someone and you cheat, you violate the game, then the game can't continue for you or for the other person. And so that's a bad deal. And you feel ashamed. Well, that's good, because that helps you maintain your ability to play games. But then you can articulate that and you can say, oh, there's a general principle there, which is don't cheat when you're playing games. And then you can elevate that to the status of a commandment, say, something like that. So then the religious injunction sort of sits on top of the biological reality, and they match, and that's a really good.
Interesting.
That's a really good thing.
Next one, act so that you can tell the truth about how you act. Kind of ties into what we
Really
just talked
correct.
about, really.
Yeah.
Sure.
Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient.
Right. That's rule 7 in the book. So here's a strange idea, but this is another example of, I think, where the physical and the metaphysical touch. So we talked about what reality might look like. There's a material reality, let's say, that's what is, but then there's the reality of what could be, that's potential, it's something like that. And so potential has this weird existence. Well, here's another strange thing. You might say, well, what's the best way of conceptualizing reality at the highest level of abstraction? What is reality? There's this old Taoist symbol, the yin and yang symbol, eh? So there's a black serpent, and it has a white dot in it, and there's a white serpent, and it has a black dot in it, and they're tail to tail. And that whole symbol is Tao. And Tao means a bunch of things. It means potential. It means the way of life. So to live in Tao is to live in the proper manner. And you kind of live on the border between the black serpent and the white serpent. And then you say, well, what are those two things? Well, they're the two ultimate categories of reality, yin and yang. Well, how would you translate that into English? Well, masculine, feminine, that's one translation. But a better one, I would say, is order and chaos. You say, well, what's order and what's chaos? Well, order is when you're where what you're doing is producing what you want to have happen. Okay, so why is that orderly? It's because you can predict it. You do A, and you want B to happen, and B happens. So what does that mean? It means you know where you are, you know what you're doing, and things are working. And then you're calm, because there's nothing to be nervous about, and you're moderately happy, because you're getting what you need and want. And there's evidence that you are competent, because that's why things are working. That's order. Now, everyone knows that order can be shattered into disorder at the drop of a hat. You can be walking down the street and you're all happy and you're with your partner and, you know, she makes a mistake and steps off the curb and a bus hits her. It's like in 1 second you are not anymore in order. Like the bottom has fallen out of your life. And that's why there's a black dot in the white serpent. It's like, orderly as it is, look the hell out, because your life can be flipped upside down in a moment.
Right.
Okay. Well, then sometimes you're in a dire state and everything looks absolutely hopeless and you get a new realization and bang, you know, everything snaps together. And so that's when you're in chaos and order can reveal itself. Okay, so order and chaos. You can think about it as the ice that you skate on with the water below. That's another way of thinking about it. Now you say, well, is that real? Is it really that the world is made out of order and chaos? Well, here's something weird. You have 2 hemispheres, right? And hypothetically, they were selected by the processes of natural evolution, right? They were selected by reality. Well, you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. So it's kind of like, well, reality must have 2 elements, because why would you need 2 hemispheres otherwise? And they do have relatively separate consciousnesses, those 2 hemispheres. Think, well, okay, we've been selected to have this bifurcated view of reality. Well, what are they specialized for? Turns out the left hemisphere is specialized for those places where your routines work. That's the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is specialized for all those places you go when you don't know what you're doing. So the left hemisphere is specialized for order, and the right hemisphere is specialized for chaos. And so then you might think, well, does that mean that the world being is really made out of order and chaos? It's like, well, if you use the Darwinian logic, that's what it means. Okay, so what does meaning signify? Well, here's what it is, as far as I can tell. So imagine that you're watching a gymnast, and two gymnasts. We'll start with the first one. And the gymnast pops out on the floor and does her routine, and she's on it, man. Like, you can tell this girl has put her 50,000 hours in, and every single thing, impossible thing she does in succession is flawless, right? And at the end, she, what would you say?
Voila.
Displays herself
Right.
to the crowd, right? And the crowd is like, wow, that's so impressive, because they think, wow, she's human, and look what humans can do, and isn't that so cool? And they're so thrilled, and, the judges go 9.8, 9.8, 9.8. It's like, because I think it's 10 points for gymnasts, and it's like, well, now what does the next gymnast do? Because how do you top perfection, right? Because you can't. But that's not true. You can. So the next gymnast comes out, and she goes through her routine too, and it's perfect. But it's more than perfect, because you can see that with every bloody move she makes, she's pushing herself right to the ragged edge of disaster. Like, she's risking the performance of her life. And that means she's risking a big mistake, because you risk that when you do the performance of your life. And you can just see her straining. It's like when you hear a great violinist or a great guitarist play something, and they bend and twist all the notes, so they're kind of rough and ragged, and they know how to do it perfectly, and they put this vicious edge on it. It's like, you just love that. And so the gymnast is out there just stretching herself right to the limit of her ability, right? And then she does voila, right? And she's sweating, and it's like triumph, and the whole damn crowd just leaps to their feet, because she was better than perfect. She was perfect in the way that will make her more perfect in the future. And that's meaningful. And that's why the crowd leaps to its feet. And she's on that border between chaos and order. And that's meaningful. And so what I would say is, what your brain does for you is tell you when you're in the right place at the right time by infusing your life with significance and engagement. And it's saying, look, you've got the cosmos is lined up around you. It really, truly is. You're right in the right place at the right time. You're in your domain of competence, but you're stretching yourself so that you're actually improving at the same time. And that's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And so I think for a long time we've cast doubt on the reality of meaning. That's part of the death of God. There's no real meaning in life. It's like, no. It does not look like that's true. It looks like it might be the case that there's nothing more real in life than the sense of meaning. I actually think you can make, well, I do make that case in 12 Rules for Life. I think you can make a completely coherent case that meaning is an unerring guide. There's limits. If you're going to allow your sense of meaning to guide you, you don't want to lie to yourself, because you pathologize the instinct. Because if you keep filling your head up with nonsense, the meaning generator is going to become corrupted, and it's going to make things shine for you that shouldn't shine. They'd only shine for someone who's corrupt. So if you're going to be guided by your sense of meaning, then don't fill your spirit with garbage. And that sort of applies to the first few rules. Don't lie. Don't do things that you hate.
You're building upon the previous rules.
Right. Don't make the thing that guides you ill. And so you guys like to have open discussions. And like what we're doing when we're having an open discussion is we're trying to elevate each other's spirits. And so that's like rule 9, right? Assume that the person you're listening to knows something you don't. It's like, there's things you need to know. There's things I need to know. There's things you need to know. If we actually have a talk, maybe we'll all come away less stupid. And since if you're stupid, you wander into a pit, then maybe it would be better if you weren't stupid. And so I'd rather come on and say, well, let's engage. So let's occupy that place of meaningful conversation. Let's trust it and see where it goes. And then let's assume that whatever happens is the best thing that could have happened.